Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a pretty striking number. A 245% tariff mentioned alongside the Trump administration's China trade policies.
Right.
We've got some sources, and the plan is to figure out, where this figure might actually come from and what it really means in the context of that whole trade situation.
Yeah, that 245% definitely jumps out. But the first thing to get straight is that this wasn't some kind of flat tax on all Chinese goods, not even close.
Oh, yeah.
The bulk of the tariffs, the ones hitting over $360 billion in goods between, 2018 and 2020, they were more in the 10 to 25% range.
Right, the Section 301 tariffs.
Exactly. Those were aimed at intellectual property theft concerns and other things deemed unfair trade practices.
So definitely not 245% across the board then, which makes you wonder,
Yeah.
where does a number that high come from? It must be something really specific.
That's precisely it. While those Section 301 tariffs were broad, these really, really high percentages, like the 245% we're looking at, they usually signal something else. Anti-dumping duties, or AD,
Yeah.
and countervailing duties, CVD.
AD/CVD. Got it. Highly targeted tariffs.
Very targeted, applied just to specific products where there's been an investigation.
Okay, let's focus on that 245%. Did the sources give any clues about a tariff exactly at that level during that time?
Well, what's interesting is they pointed to something close, but actually even higher, and before the main Trump administration tariffs kicked in.
Oh, like when?
Back in 2016, actually, the U.S. imposed a duty of, get this, 265.79% on cold-rolled steel imports from China.
Wow, 265%. Okay, so that wasn't the 245%, but it clearly shows these kinds of super high specific duties were already a tool being used.
Precisely. It sets a precedent. It shows that reaching levels like 245% or even higher for specific products wasn't out of the blue.
So the Trump administration then continued using these types of targeted high tariffs.
Absolutely. The sources confirm they applied similar high AD/CVD rates to other specific Chinese imports, things like aluminum foil, stainless steel, certain types of it, and solar panels too.
And the justification for these was?
The U.S. government determined that these goods were either being dumped, so sold in the U.S. below their production cost or home market price, or that they were benefiting from unfair subsidies from the Chinese government, hurting U.S. producers.
Right, so these aren't just arbitrary numbers pulled out of a hat. There's an actual process.
Yes, there's a formal process. The Department of Commerce conducts pretty detailed investigations based on petitions, usually from U.S. industries.
Right.
If they find evidence of dumping or subsidies causing injury, that's when they calculate and recommend these duties. The rates are meant to offset the unfair advantage.
So for everyone listening, it's really crucial to separate this potential 245% figure from the broader trade war tariffs we heard so much about. They're different things.
That's the key takeaway, really. The 10-25% Section 301 tariffs were wide-ranging, hitting hundreds of billions in trade. These AD/CVD rates, even if they're incredibly high, like 245% or 265%, are much narrower. They hit specific products from specific countries.
Makes sense. Big impact on those specific industries, but not the same as the general tariffs. This really helps clarify things. If listeners want to dive deeper into the mechanics of all this from that 2018-2020 period, the sources mentioned some useful podcast resources.
Yeah, definitely. For just understanding how tariffs work, the basics, NPR's Planet Money is great. They had episodes like Trade War Summer and Tariffs 101 that really break it down.
Good starting points.
And then for the real-world impact, The Daily from the New York Times covered specific stories. If you want the policy nitty-gritty, Politico's Trade Podcast is solid.
And for the global picture,
Bloomberg's Stephanomics is always good for that broader economic perspective. And specifically for these high duties, searching a podcast app for, like, Trump steel tariffs China, or maybe anti-dumping duties podcast should pull up relevant discussions from back then.
Perfect. So wrapping this up, the main point is, if you hear about a 245% tariff related to Trump and China, it's almost certainly referring to one of these specific anti-dumping or countervailing duties on a particular product, maybe steel or something similar.
Right. It's not the general rate that applied to the bulk of imports during the trade dispute.
It really highlights how governments have different tools in their trade policy toolkit, doesn't it? The broad brush versus the very fine point.
It does, and it makes you think, about the effects. When does a government use a broad tariff, and when does it opt for something incredibly specific like this? What are the different impacts on industries, jobs, and us as consumers? It's worth pondering which other sectors might face these kinds of targeted actions and why.